Get you up the front. A very warm welcome to the Australian Country Partner Seminar for this morning. It's our great privilege to be able to hold this seminar for the participants with a special focus on agribusiness and agri-tech services. We've got four great speakers who've flown in from Australia to make the presentation. I'd first like to acknowledge the Australian High Commissioner to India, Mr. Patrick Suckling, the Consul General to South India, Mr. Sean Kelly, Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner South Asia, Ms. Nicola Watkinson, and the Australian Agriculture Counsellor to India, Ms. Dr. Slava Zeman. Thank you for your participation. A very warm welcome, I should make a very special welcome to the Andhra Pradesh delegation. I believe some have driven overnight to get here specifically for this seminar. Others have flown in this morning. A very big thank you for attending today and to all the participants. To get underway, I'd like to ask the Australian High Commissioner to India, Mr. Patrick Suckling, to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Grayson, and thank you everybody for making time out of your precious days for coming and listening to this seminar. I'll talk briefly because I think there's a range of much more expert people than me on agribusiness, so I'll talk briefly, and there's others who are going to speak as well. I'll talk briefly about the bigger, broader relationship between Australia and India and just touch on agribusiness so that I don't say things that other people may say. The first thing is to say that I don't think the relationship between India and Australia has ever been stronger, and it's a relationship that's been growing since independence, obviously, but in the last 10 years it's been growing quite dramatically, and I'd say in the last 3 or 4 years it's been growing extraordinarily strongly. And as I've said to people, our Governor-General came here last year in November after there'd been back-to-back visits, which was the first time ever that an Indian Prime Minister went to Australia and an Australian Prime Minister came to India in the same year, so that was in itself historic. It was also historic that Prime Minister Modi addressed our Parliament, which no Indian leader had ever done before that either. But as a consequence of their political commitment, the two Prime Ministers, to taking the relationship up a notch, and as a consequence of a huge amount of work that was done in the lead up to the respective visits in terms of providing an agenda, deliverables, a stronger trajectory for the relationship, we I think hit a high watermark last year. So when the Governor-General was here, he came to participate in the 20th anniversary of the Defence College that he'd been to in Delhi. So he came in under the radar. It wasn't an official visit, but the President of India nevertheless decided to ask him to come and have a cup of tea with him. And President Mukherjee's been looking at our relationship for 50 years. As you know, he's been a significant public figure in Indian life for half a century. And he said that in different ministerial capacities over the years, including numerously Foreign Minister and Finance Minister, among other things, that he'd got to know the Australian relationship very well with India. And he said, in his view, that he didn't think the relationship that he now saw had ever been stronger, deeper, or more prospective. And I think that's a fairly sincere and fairly objective assessment for someone who's been around for a long time. And the reason that it's so prospective and so strong is not only the political commitment of our two leaders, which is really pushing things along, but also some very fundamental interests that are converging between our two countries. And so those converging interests are driving an enthusiasm for one another and an interest in one another that is really, I think, delivering the relationship a critical mass that it's never had before. And once the relationship gets critical mass, then that mass tends to just keep it moving. So my feeling is the relationship is in that phase now, or just entering that phase. If I speak briefly about what those elements of those converging interests are, they can be broken roughly into 3 pillars, 3 parts. One is obviously the economic relationship, which is a big reason why we're here today. As Mr. Modi said to our Parliament when he spoke to our Parliament, he said that there's not an area of national priority for India that he doesn't see Australia being a natural partner in. And I think he's very genuine in that, and he reflects a view across both the federal government in India but also state governments that there are complementarities between the Indian economies and the Australian economy, between the centres respectively and the state governments that are seeing a whole lot more activity and interest in one another. So the very fundamental economic convergence, that there are all sorts of areas for that, and agribusiness, agriculture is obviously a fundamental one. But energy and resources is clearly, for us, a strategic partnership. India sees us as the North Asian economies have seen us for, in some cases, the last 50 years, as a long-term, secure, reliable supplier of resources for energy for India, for development. And once you make that connection that Australia is a long-term bet and a reliable bet for your energy security, then that means we're seen, I think, in a different way in India than we had been seen. So we're doing a lot more together on coal for electricity, but particularly for steel as well. We're doing a lot more prospectively in LNG. Australia will be the biggest producer, if not exporter, of LNG gas by 2018. So there's enormous interest in LNG gas. And as you probably know, India is investing heavily in LNG capabilities. There's an interest in uranium, and this week, yesterday or the day before yesterday, our parliamentary committee tabled their response to the uranium treaty that we're negotiating with India to sell uranium to India. So that should all happen sooner rather than later, and that's a very significant and again another strategic element of the relationship. And there's renewable energy as well, which Tamil Nadu is one of the leading states and would know a lot about. So Australia has a lot of capabilities in those areas as well. Australia has world's best mining technology and capabilities, and Mr. Modi wants, and state governments want, those technologies and those capabilities in to help stand up the Indian mining sector. So resources energy is a huge part of the relationship. Agribusiness is very significant as well. There's another revolution coming to India in agriculture. We see it everywhere we go in India, and the discussions that we have in the centre. We call it farm to fork in Australia, and that revolution is coming across every element of that chain, supply chain in India. So whether it's raising productivity in the farms through better seed technology, drought-resistant technology, low water usage technology, better yields of milk, for example. I think our cows produce 25 litres of milk a day versus 5 litres from an Indian cow. This is a lot of things technologically that Australia can do or can provide, and can work in partnership with Indian entities to raise the productivity of agribusiness in the farms, and not only farms, in aquaculture as well, in terms of fisheries. And then we're told India wastes, doesn't completely waste, but it's not as pristine and as pure and as good as it should be, 40% of everything that's produced. And so transport, storage, cold chain supply, all of those sorts of capabilities are coming to India. Then moving up the value chain, food processing. Everywhere I go in India, every chief minister asks if food processing capabilities can come to India from Australia. So an enormous focus on adding value to the agricultural produce that's produced in India. Australia has some expertise in those areas. And then finally, retail, in terms of much more significant retail outlets, which ultimately means supermarkets, multi-brand retail. And once multi-brand retail comes in a big way, then you've got to come all the way back down the supply chain. Just like the car industry actually in India had to build a supply chain all the way down to the last widget, effectively, to become the 4th largest manufacturer of cars in the world. Something like that, I imagine, is going to happen in agribusiness with multi-brand retail. So enormous opportunities in terms of agriculture. Skills and education, another thing. I mean, everyone talks about India's demographic dividend, 500 million people coming through the system by 2022, 2030 for jobs, and therefore enormous growth opportunities off the back of a young population. But that demographic dividend could become a demographic nightmare if those kids don't have the right skills and the right education to get jobs and avail themselves of the opportunities that are coming in India. So again, Australia is seen as a world leader in terms of not only education at the tertiary level, We have about 50,000 odd Indian students currently studying in Australia, which is okay, and it's growing at about 15 to 20% a year now, so very strong growth. But getting Australian skills providers to come to India and provide vocational and technical training to so many different elements of the Indian economy, that's something that we're being encouraged, again, very, very strongly to come and work in partnership with Indian companies and Indian governments to achieve. Infrastructure is another area. I mean, you know, Mr. Modi says he wants to build 100 new cities by 2050. So everything, town planning, wastewater management, green, clean buildings, you name it, India wants it, roads, ports, airports, tunnels, everything you can think of. And so, again, Australia has some capabilities in those areas, but we've also got a lot of money because we have compulsory superannuation schemes. So everyone for the last 30 years has to pay a certain amount of money for their pension, and then the government has to pay a certain amount as well. So our pension funds, for example, have the third largest funds under management in the world. It's currently $1.9 trillion, and by 2030 it'll be around $7 trillion. And that money's looking for quality investments to invest in. What Mr. Modi says and the state chief ministers say, and what the Tamil Nadu government is saying, which is precisely the whole reason for this event, this whole investment summit now, is attracting a lot more investment into India. And so if we can get some of that money into India, that will be a very significant contribution, I think, to standing up the next phase of growth in India. So that's and then there's health, and there's IT, and there's pharma, and there's fertilizers, and there's so many different areas where there are all sorts of connections, commercial connections being made between our two countries. So because that's such a perspective and such an important part of our relationship, the governments have decided, our prime ministers have decided we should conclude we call it a free trade agreement, because free trade agreements for us cover goods, services and investment. India calls it a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement because that's how India defines a comprehensive agreement which covers the spectrum of economic activity. So the Prime Ministers agreed last year to negotiate one by the end of this year. So we're working frantically to try and meet that objective, that task that the Prime Ministers have set. And if we achieve a free trade agreement with India, then that'll provide a much stronger platform for more diversified trade and investment between our two economies. Because at the moment, if you look at Australian exports into India, 75% is coal, gold and copper. And what we need to do is diversify that spread and build a much more multi-layered, multi-leveled economic interaction. But that's the economic relationship. It's respectable. Last year we did about $16 billion worth of bilateral trade, but we did $160 billion with China. So China's 10 times what we do with India. So we feel that in one sense gives you a sense of the potential between our two economies. $16 billion is not bad, but $160 billion is a lot better. So we feel that there's a lot of scope economically, and getting our businesses to know one another better, the industries to know one another better, the better sense of what sectoral advantages there are between our two economies is something that these sorts of conferences we find very important in building that sort of better understanding and those connections. Very briefly, the second pillar of our relationship is security and strategic, and our interests are converging quite strongly in that area as well. Traditionally, we didn't see so much eye to eye on strategic and security issues. In the Cold War, India was much more with Russia, we were with the United States, then there was the nuclear problems in the 90s. But since about the early 2000s, our security relationship, our defence relationship has become much stronger. So we just had our defence minister in town last week, and it's quite significant, the agreements that we've made and the things that we're doing together on strategic and security issues, because the strategic calculus in our region is changing in the Indo-Pacific. There's all sorts of new uncertainties, there's all sorts of strategic flux, and there's a shared interest between Australia and India in making sure that the region that has both delivered us such prosperity over the last 50 to 60 years, the Indo-Pacific, continues to be a stable, peaceful, secure place where there's free lanes of transit and things like that. So there's a very real sense of our two nations wanting to work to get together more on strategic and security issues. And so tomorrow I'm going to Vizag to participate in our inaugural maritime exercise, bilateral maritime exercise, which we've agreed to do every 2 years with India now. So our militaries are now starting to exercise, and we're looking at air-to-air and army-to-army, and we do a lot more in intelligence and counter-terrorism and all sorts of things. So the security relationship, the military defence relationship, is a world away from where it was when I was posted in India 20 years ago. So in that sense, enormous change, driven by some real interests that are converging in a very hard-nosed way on that front. And then finally, the relationship, I think, is in a much stronger position because of just the people-to-people connections between our two countries. So if you look at, in the 80s, there were about 50,000 odd people of Indian origin living in Australia. There's now nearly 500,000. Last year, about 2 lakh of people from Australia came to India to visit, and more than 2 lakh of Indians went to Australia to visit, and that's growing 15% both ways. So there's just a lot more connectivity and interest between our two peoples. So in that sense, that's providing a big part of that critical mass, because people are just getting on with their interactions and their own interests vis-a-vis one another in each other's countries. So in all of that, we're doing, I think, very well. People say there should be only one area of rivalry between India and Australia, and that should be cricket. And that should be the start and the end of it. And I was thinking when I was coming here that of all of the advantages that we have with Tamil Nadu, and many of the things I've spoken about in those sectors, we're doing things with Tamil Nadu, or we're looking at doing things with Tamil Nadu. I was thinking there was one thing we shouldn't be doing with Tamil Nadu, which is this fast bowling academy that we have between Dennis Lilly started it, and we're training Indian fast bowlers how to be better. And part of you thinks, well, that's not a good thing, particularly given the way we played the Ashes recently. You'd think we need every advantage we can take, but in a way that's a symbol of everything that's good about opening the doors to one another, because if our fast bowlers can train Indian fast bowlers to be better, and the level of competition gets higher, and the level of skills required is more, then in a sense everyone wins. And really that's so much a part of what we think is the value of opening up one another's economies to each other, because if you open the doors, then things start to happen, and those winds of competition and innovation and new ways of doing things tend to raise the levels of performance all round. And so, having thought a little bit more deeply about it, I think it's a wonderful thing that our fast bowlers are teaching Indian fast bowlers how to knock us over. So with those words, welcome. Thank you very much for all coming.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That's, I think, a great scene setter for the rest of the seminar today. I do know that the High Commissioner is a passionate supporter of the India relationship, and who travelled extensively across India as a young man when many other Australians were going to Europe and Asia. So I think that's a reflection of his interest in this relationship. If I could ask the Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner to South Asia, Ms Nicola Watkinson, to perhaps reflect on the Australian Trade Commission's work in India. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today. This is a very exciting time in India's history. The levels of growth and the levels of development that we're seeing are reaching an all-time high. And being here at the Tamil Nadu Investor Summit is a great indication of the level of activity that we're seeing here in Tamil Nadu. It's a very exciting place to be at the moment. And Australian companies are really interested to be a part of that success and to look for long-term partnerships with businesses here in Tamil Nadu to look at how to grow and prosper together. So this is not just about selling Australian technologies or products into the market, but really forming long-term relationships where by coming together we can actually grow and expand our businesses and find new opportunities to work together both here in Tamil Nadu, in India, and into global marketplaces. The level of interest that we're seeing from Australia was very adequately demonstrated earlier this year, where we had the opportunity to bring over 450 Australian companies in one go to come and look at how the market is developing and how to actually work more successfully here in India. And just yesterday I had a chance to meet one of our Australian investors here in Tamil Nadu, one of our food manufacturing equipment groups, who is setting up a manufacturing plant here in Chennai. And they were sort of talking about the experiences that they've had and the growth that they see here in the marketplace. And at the same time, the evening before, I was meeting with a delegation from the University of Melbourne that has been setting up some long-term partnerships with IIT Madras, both in the areas of research collaborations, in terms of faculty exchange, and also now in terms of industry collaborations to jointly work together to solve some of the problems that are facing both Australia and India. Earlier this month, we had a delegation from Tamil Nadu to Australia looking at technology solutions in the automotive sector. I think that's a good indication of the kind of interest we're seeing in where Australia and India can play together, with Australia providing some interesting IP and technology and efficiency improvements to support what is a really growing automotive sector here in Tamil Nadu. And later this month, we're also seeing the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce take a delegation from Tamil Nadu over to Australia to explore business opportunities. So there is a lot already happening, but I think opportunities like today allow us to explore where else this relationship can go. From the work of the Australian Trade Commission, we've identified some very specific areas of opportunity that we think offer good prospects for your business as well as for ours. And we would welcome the chance to explore those opportunities with you further. Two of those kind of areas of opportunity are being explored today, and you see we've brought over 4 experts from Australia to talk about the dairy development and the sustainable fisheries area, which we think are just 2 examples of the ways in which we can work together. But there are other ones, and we have an office here in Chennai. Grayson is the head of that office, and many of my team are around here today. So do please take the opportunity to talk to Cameron or Anaban or Adil. I can see a few of them around the room today. Or look at our website, austrade.gov.au, to find out how to contact us, see where the areas of opportunity are, and explore how we can do more business together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki. And yes, absolutely. If you'd like to talk about trade and investment or education, please speak to one of my colleagues afterwards. To round out the introduction to our program today, I'd like to ask Dr. Slava Zeman, Australia's Agricultural Counsellor to India, to say a few words around agriculture. Thank you.
Good morning, distinguished guests and delegates. I will be speaking on why Australia is a natural partner for Tamil Nadu's agricultural development. Australia is a significant producer and exporter of a large range of agricultural and fisheries commodities, such as grains, wool, dairy products, live animals, and seafood. Australia exports well over half of its food production. In 2014, Australia exported agricultural products worth over 43 billion Australian dollars. This is a result of natural advantages and also strengths of Australia agriculture created by the industry and government policies. First, natural advantages of Australia's agriculture that make our production and products more competitive include large farms, availability of a natural feed, important for example, meat and dairy industries, clean environment, and favorable animal and plant health situation due to the isolation of the continent. Strengths of Australia's agriculture created by industry and government policies are, first, the government has reformed market interventions, and the level of producer support is currently the second lowest in the OECD. So in brief, our producers are not subsidized. The gains from reducing inefficiencies have contributed to the productivity growth, particularly in dairy, grain, and livestock production. Australia continues to promote productivity through reducing legislative burdens, through extension systems, and through improving labour availability and skills. Australia's producers have a long history of innovation, adoption of technology, science and research. Many adopt advanced farming practices and incorporate improved plant varieties and animal genetics into their farming. They also benefit from good education system that leads to educated workforce capable of using technology and cutting-edge farming practices. Our producers have several advantages that stem from strong government controls, such as maintenance of Australia's favourable animal and plant health situation through comprehensive quarantine and biosecurity systems, and export certification based on food safety, animal and plant health systems. And last, the Australian government supports cooperative research that reflects industry needs. The funding and strategic direction of research organisations are shared between the government and industry. So how is all this relevant to Tamil Nadu? And why do we say that Australia is a natural partner for Tamil Nadu's agricultural development? Let's consider Tamil Nadu's dairy sector as an example. We understand the Indian and Tamil Nadu governments support the dairy industry to increase milk productivity and create linkages between milk producers and the milk processing sector, including through the National Dairy Plan. Australia has products, expertise and technology that would fit well with Tamil Nadu's dairy sector. So, on a commercial basis, Australia can help, for example, with training of animal health professionals and extension resources, expertise in breeding through artificial insemination centres, and expertise in cattle feeding to maximise milk production. The Government of India has policies and programs to improve indigenous Indian cattle breeds because these are seen as the most suitable for the Indian climate. Because Australia's dairy industry operates across climates that are similar to India's and achieve high milk productivity in these climates, our bovine genetics would help in improving milk productivity of Indian dairy cattle. Several Australian dairy experts are attending this meet, and I hope they will catch up with their Tamil Nadu counterparts. I won't repeat comments on a free trade agreement. I just would like to say that over there are several copies of a brochure that the Australian government prepared and which explains how both India and Australia would benefit from a free trade agreement. And on that note, thank you for giving me opportunity to provide brief comments on why we believe Australia is a natural partner for Tamil Nadu's agricultural development. Thank you.
Thank you, Slava. Very much appreciated. All right, well, let's get into the technical sessions part of the program. Before I do that, I do want to acknowledge a number of people who I didn't before, and I apologise for that. I just wanted to acknowledge Professor Bhaskaran Manamaran and his team from the TNFU who've travelled from Tuticorin. So thank you very much for your presence here today, sir, and your team. The Department of Fisheries from TN, the Society of Aquaculture Professionals, many members of whom are here today, so thank you. To the Indo-Australian Chamber of Commerce members, and to the Australia-India Alumni Association members and the AP Government Dairy, of course, who I've mentioned before. So we appreciate your presence here today. We're going to start with the dairy part of the program first, the two speakers on the dairy sector. This first speaker today is Dr. Philip Chamberlain, who's a Managing Director for Chamberlain Veterinary Services based in Brisbane, Queensland. Dr. Chamberlain has over 25 years worth of experience in tropical dairy research, development, production, genetics, health management, strategic planning. He is a friend of India, having travelled a number of times to India already.